Awesome. And my name's Kevin Mack. I think you all know me by now, maybe. And we had a request to, at the end of our last front-end special interest group, to talk about kind of patterns in HTML and CSS and object-oriented CSS. So I put together a quick little deck on introduction to object-oriented CSS, and then we're going to focus on the media object and then also the flag object, which the media object is one of the most common design UI patterns that are out there. For those that don't know what UI is, I say it all the time, it's user interface, so it's the actual interface that people are interacting with. So my Twitter, if you guys don't follow me on Twitter, I'm trying to get my numbers up. Yeah, it's a shameless promotion, you know, I'm nice transition.
You can buy followers.
I should just do that. I don't know what's up with my pointer lately. So kind of just talking about web demands as a whole, and I could have probably called this project demands. Just right now with the ever-growing landscape of the web, there are so many things that are changing, and projects are having more and more demands of the front-end developer as well as the other development teams kind of working in collaboration. And as user experience becomes more and more important with the day-to-day actions that we have for planning, developing, and looking at how people are interacting with the projects that we have, there's just a lot of need for code to be maintained, really a high focus on reuse as well as just general use of how people are interacting with it. So today it's not like you sit down there and you don't plan before you code. You should be planning and you should be thinking about different patterns that you have out there so you can reduce the amount of time and efforts for testing as well as the overall code that you're actually writing. So I just kind of put this up here as an introduction to kind of all the topics, and especially how it's going to relate to object-oriented CSS and some of the patterns out there. I don't know what is up with my clicker these days. So with these concerns, how do we deal with them as a whole? And one of the sayings that I like to put up there a lot, and I've used this in other presentations before, is to create sustainable and flexible systems for ever-growing projects. And there's a lot of like misperceptions or maybe misunderstandings about websites and this idea that a website or a project that you're working on isn't going to change. So as you're developing projects, no matter what, they're going to change, and change is kind of a positive thing as a whole for a project because there's unknowns, whether it's business requirements change, whether technology changes, whether budget or scope changes halfway through the project, or just some really great idea where you have to be flexible. So you need to create systems as well as code that's going to be flexible to change over time. I think this is backwards, my thing here. So I'll stop complaining about this and just move on. So one of the quotes that I really, really like is this quote by Stephen Hay. This is a really popular quote, and you probably have seen this before. And it's just saying that we're not designing we're not designing pages, but a series of components that work well together. Just think of them like puzzle pieces that come together. So there's no longer like, when you think about developing a front-end interface, I'm going to develop the about page. You're developing a series of different modules, different pieces of the interface that work well and play well together and kind of all form into pages. And those same components that you're using on the About Us page can be used on the Contact Us page as well as the home page. So it's just really thinking about, instead of looking at dissecting individual pages, but dissecting pieces of the interface and breaking it down into modules as a whole. So what I like to say is to break websites into modules. And my clicker is wacky. I should be. I'm going to just stop using it. What? Yeah, I think I'm backwards today. So break websites into modules. Again, just kind of dissecting your overall design and breaking it into these reusable components as a whole. And this is another quote that I like to put up there, and this is from Ben Callahan from Sparkbox, and he said modularity is a requirement of maintainable systems. So just kind of backtracking to what I was saying about the web demands as well as project demands, just really thinking about modularity and breaking down your code into different pieces. And when I say modules, I'm referring to something like as a zone. So if you think of a section of the website, that's what I mean by a module. So a really great way to do this on the front end or start thinking about it is object-oriented CSS or OOCSS, which you'll see it primarily written out this way. And I'm just going to do a kind of a brief description of what it is. And here's something that came from Smashing Magazine, and this is a good summary for it. But it's just to encourage reuse, more efficient style sheets that are easier to add to and as well as maintain. So last month we talked about, or we watched a video on CSS or ITCSS, and that was more about the architecture or the approaches for us. And object-oriented CSS is also another way of architecting or crafting CSS in a way for maintainability, reuse, and also breaking it down for primarily reuse and maintainability. And there's two main principles with object-oriented CSS, and the two are separation of structure from the skin and separation of containers and the content. So the first one is really hitting on that you can create these various structures that don't align to the actual design and the design elements. So instead of putting the styling inside of it, you're separating those out and you're using them as helper classes inside your code. And the second one is it's hitting more on specificity as well as the context of how elements are within another container. And it's reducing dependency based off of the context of wherever your selectors are. And I'm going to show you two examples of separation of structure of skin and separation of containers and content. And when we talk about the media object and flag object, it's really on this first principle, but I'll relate it to the second one too. So here is a block code. You may kind of struggle to see it, but these are all ID selectors in CSS. So you have button, box, widget. One of the things that you'll notice inside here, there are a lot of common properties in between all of these. So you can notice that like width is different across all of them. Height is an additional property that's added on widget. But when we look at background, box shadow, and this border, it's something that's consistent across the board. So looking at this is aligning with that first principle of it, the structure and the skin, where you could reduce this and you could create a class. This isn't really the best example, but it's just to illustrate the this first principle. So we have button, it has this width, the height, this box, and now those properties have been dissected out, and we put skin into its own style. So now I could have button and skin on a selector and have that styling for it, but then I could also have button and maybe skin too that's a different look and feel. It just allows me to reuse those properties, and then if the overall styling needs to change in the properties, say it goes from this linear gradient to a solid color of gray, I can update it in one spot and it cascades through the rest of my project. So that's the first one. Second one is, again, the containers and content, separation of it. And here's where I was talking about kind of the specificity or it within inside of a dependency. So here's sidebar and a H3 or header 3, and it has some styling attached to it. And then if I wanted to apply that styling, say to like an H2 in my footer, it would look something like this. And then what you have to start doing is applying all these additional selectors at the end, and it becomes really hard to manage and maintain it. And this is definitely not the right way of doing code. And sometimes, this does come up, and it's not always the worst. But a lot of times you see it more like this, where you have sidebar, H3, and then many lines of thousands of code later, you have footer and H2, and you're just replicating it. And this happens actually very frequently. And instead of doing this, you should be really thinking about how I can take out those actual skinning elements and be developing them into a way that is reusable code and selectors as well as styles. So that's the main kind of breakdown of what object-oriented CSS is and the two principles that are attached to it. It's a pretty easy concept as a whole. So getting into the media and flag object, the media object was created by Nicole Sullivan, and the flag object was created based off the media object by Harry Roberts. And the flag object and the media object, they have a similar look and feel for the pattern, but the flag object allows it to be a little bit more flexible, and I'll explain what it is by kind of also showing you an example of it. So again, they're pretty much the same thing. It's just the CSS properties that are attached to them, and I'll walk you through those. Here's an example of the media object in the world right now. So the media object is just having an image on one side and content on the right. So you see this a lot when you're talking about a user profile and their name associated with it, as well as like posts. So right here where it has this icon on the top, it's Samira and Mary Lynn right above little bub. And that would be an example of a media object, as well as up here where it's my avatar and it says what's on your mind, and it's that text box. That's also another example of the media object. My Twitter avatar, my name, and the handle next to each other, that's an example of it, and all my followers that I have. And then that number is completely fake, so I wish I had that many.
Just 4.
Yeah.
He's got 4 following.
Yeah, so, and then also other examples of it. But Twitter, Facebook use this throughout everywhere. If you actually went to Facebook, you could highlight them. But it's a very, very common UI pattern, and it's one of my favorite ones to use out there. And once you understand how it's built, you'll start noticing it more and more out there. And just having awareness of the media and flag object, you'll start seeing the same thing everywhere. So what I'm going to do is go into a CodePen. Alright, so I've just created this little blank CodePen, and I have this saved out there on my CodePen. It's just Kevin Mack 18, which I don't know why it's based off my GitHub, and I hate that handle for GitHub as well as for my CodePen, but it's out there. The 18 stands for that I'm 18 for forever, if you're wondering. Yeah. So, no, my birthday's April 18th, so. Anyways, so up here, just if you're not familiar with CodePen, is HTML and CSS, and the output's going to go here. And I just am using the star selector before and after for box sizing for kind of some base setting. Before getting into the media object, I'm going to do a quick little demo on Sass also, because I'm going to use Sass to kind of build this out. So I'm just going to do foo. And I'm going to create a selector here called foo. And I'm just going to put some in there for right now. Alright, so over here we see this, and we have foo. Inside there I'm going to do _bar, and I'm just going to do a color red. Then for bar I'm going to do background color lime. This is more kind of base setting for stuff. So how this renders out inside of from Sass to CSS is we have lime here, and I'll make that bigger for you guys.
It's the colors are projected.
I know.
We just need a new one.
Yeah, we do. I don't know if you can. Lauren, do you know if you can?
The,
It's going to throw me all off.
Oh, it's like in your profile options.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Yeah, it's
I don't really want to do that, though.
like editor settings, yeah.
Do, 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 do.
yeah, that's good.
All right. Cool. Now I don't know how to get back.
Wow.
Yeah. You guys just ruined my day. Is that any better? Okay, cool. Alright, so looking at how this actually renders is I have this lorem ipsum inside here, and I have foo, and it has a background color of lime. Now right now, if I wanted to add, let's make this span foo bar, or it was a _ bar. This guy is going to be red inside here. So it just renders out as foo _bar. So what this is doing is it's just appending to foo and extending it and adding the class inside of it. So if I added another inside here, say blah, and did this, it would break foobar because I would need that selector to be foo blah _bar. So just using like BEM as like the parent to child relationship here. This is just a good way of kind of maintaining your Sass too.
You can hit the view compile to show the compiled CSS also. Just for
So right there. So I don't want anyone to get too caught up on that or be too confused moving forward on the example. Alright, so I'm going to create media, and I'm going to create media _asset, and inside there I'm going to put an image, and I'm going to make it be just a place, hold it, 50 by 50. And then inside here, I'm going to also create media _, I'll call it main. And I'm going to put an H1, H2, and I'll just put a lorem 2, and then a paragraph of lorem 50. So what this will render is looking like this. Now, the idea of the media object is the image is on the left side and the content is on the right, so it's a combination of those two. So the best way of doing this is I have my media. I'm going to create my asset, which relates back up to my code up here. And then I'm also going to just put this in here for right now, main. And I'm going to float this guy left. So we have this going on right here. Because I'm floating this, I do have to clear it. So I'm going to say, and after, content is equal to this. Display table, and then I need to add a clear. And what this does is it's just clearing my floats. Without that, if I had a background color within my media selector, it wouldn't go through. So right now we have this kind of base setting here, but this kind of breaks outside because it's wrapping around it as a float does around content. So to make this work, I do overflow hidden, and now we have this nice little column here. Another additional thing that it keeps it all in one singular column. So by putting overflow on something that's next, overflow, yeah. So this overflow on main keeps it from going outside its bounds to the image on the left. And now I'm going to just do some base resets on my H1, H2s, H3s, H4s, H5s, H6s. I'm just going to do margin top 0 because the default user agent puts those out there and they're not really necessary for this demo, as well as my paragraph tag. And then I'm going to do one little goofy thing here, just because I want to. And what this is going to do is separate the paragraph and the header by 1em. Right there. That seems like a little too much. Let's just do 0.5. There we go. That's nice. Alright, so now I have this placement. The next thing for this guy is I need to push it over so I'm not like right on top of it as a whole. And for demo purposes, I'm just going to have background color red here. Or a lime would be better probably for you. So we can see this, and I'm going to separate this. So what I like to do is create a variable, and I'm just going to call it my default unit or default space. Demo purposes, I'll do 20, and I'm going to actually change this to divided by 2. So now all I needed, I'm back to pixels, just because I didn't feel like doing that and talking about too much about units right here. So now I've added the padding left on main, and it's pushed this image over. And I'm still inside this green boundary. This is like the base setup. Now where this gets really awesome and powerful is we have this structure, and why this becomes so reusable is if I change my image from 50 to 50 pixels to 150 to 150, you can see that it just pushes the content over. And also as I scale, it works across the board. I don't actually have to define anything for the image outside of the image size as a whole. So here's a 10 by 10. And that's why you see this pattern in so many different places. It is really flexible and it is really easy to actually write. So in a couple lines of code, I'm able to have this image and all I need to do is change the size of it. Now where this gets a little bit more complex is if I wanted to do like double the size, 140, but render this out as 70. What you could do is create something like a helper class here and say image asset medium. Oops. With 70 pixels. And there's one other thing I need to do here. Class full. I'm just going to add a helper down here. And one other right here. So now, based off this is 2 times, but the image is actually being rendered out at half the size. And I could change the width of medium in here to go all the way up to 140. And even if I change this to 1,000 pixels, it's still going to render at that size. So it's kind of goofy, but that's another way of approaching it if you want to target bigger images than what's here. In addition to this, I'm going to add one other piece because usually this has one other aspect, which is the global gutter around it. And how I'm going to create that is I'm just going to create a styling called card. I'm just going to add a padding of default space, which was 20 pixels. And this is just a Sass variable, which I defined up here. And my card is going to have a background color of white and a border of 1 pixel solid, a gray color. I'm going to apply that to my media. And now we have this nice little guy. So,
Could you describe the back end of
yeah.
OOCSS perspective?
Mm-hmm.
What is that OO versus just regular vanilla CSS?
Yeah, so why this guy is purely the media class as well as like the BEM of assets and main. Those two are heavily related to each other. So main can only live inside the context of media, and the media is the parent container, and its sibling is media asset, which has that scaling effect of the image itself. And in object-oriented CSS, this is purely structure-based. There is no styling. The only styling for this is card. So I could have a variation of this media object that doesn't have that padding and kind of breaks outside the bounds of what this guy looks like. And this guy could have, I don't know, we'll just call it skin. And I could do a font size half M and font family Arial. And it could have a max width of 50%. So in the case of this, the only thing that's really changed between these two are styles, but it's using the exact same code. And there's a lot more that you can do with this. Again, it's just kind of a quick example of the media object as well as object-oriented CSS. And it's really about you're focusing on just this structure of it, making it very sound. And that's another reason why I even didn't include the padding around. So I include card to have the padding as opposed to having it on my actual media object, because there may be cases where I don't want the padding around it, similar to this, because the padding is only helpful if I have a border around it. And in the case of this guy, I kind of want to just flush to the top. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
And then the whole media theme to me is a little confusing because I'm thinking media queries and things like that.
Yeah.
Say at the time.
It's just its name, and I wish there was a better name for it.
Is it common practice to call it media and then asset and name? Like, are those common names that you use for those patterns?
Media is, and different people do it, name the inner ones differently. I've seen media underscore image. I've also seen people not do it on, so you could also do this if you wanted to simplify your DOM. Oops, what did I just, yeah. So I could just have the asset on here without the div wrapper, and I get the same output. I'm in more of the camp of having a parent container because it allows me to have that flexibility of the image, and then I can also use this guy for other things besides just an image. But the name, it's usually something like a body, main, or image, or asset. So let me just put this back. And then also back to this, because I did this as a modifier, if I remove this, I go back to the bigger image, which is also really nice. So you kind of get best of both worlds by doing it that way. Now, what the flag object is, I'm going to just literally take the same code here and do a replace for media and change it to be flag. Oops. Replace. Whoa. Well, maybe not. I don't know why I'm forgetting like how to use CodePen, but I'm really uncomfortable standing in front of people maybe. Alright, so all I've done in the second one is I've replaced media with flag. And I'm going to go down here to my Sass code, and I'm going to create the flag selector. And again, I'm just going to add the background color of lime so we can see it here. So right now, it's looking like this. And I'm going to add in asset, and then also main. How this guy is set up, it's going to have display table. And its children are going to both be display table cells. Oops. So now we have this set up here. So again, it's looking like it, but I'm using the CSS properties to render this container and the structure as a table, and using the table and table cell display options. Now for main, I can do padding left, default space. And we have the same thing. So far, it's looking like this. Now, what I like to do instead of using asset and image is just call it something like flag item or cell. It doesn't really matter. Because in the world of doing the flag object, it's more based around the content as opposed to what the selectors are. So now I have this. Let me go back to my flag object. I don't know why that's not rendering any bigger. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this. There we go. Alright, so with this, I'm also going to do a vertical align top, which will also get into another piece of why the flag object's really awesome. Alright, so one thing right here is this looks pretty much the same. I haven't talked about the spacing yet, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But before doing that, why the flag object's really awesome is if I collapse this guy, I can move the image over here to the right as opposed to the left, where in the media object I can't do that. I would have to rewrite a property and say float right and actually change the DOM order for it to work. And inside the flag object, it's on the context of where it is within the actual DOM structure. So it allows additional flexibility for the media object, but it works the exact same way. So if I make this be 200 by 200, you'll see that it scales over here, Come on. The same way that the media object did. And I can change the order of it. Now, talking about the spacing, what I can then do is say, and next flag item, padding left 20 pixels, or default space. And what that renders as is we have flag item, so flag is a display table, flag item is a table cell. They're both aligned vertically to the top. And then it says in the DOM structure, if I have flag item, and the very next class that has flag item gets a padding left. So in the case of this, if I had two of these, we'd still see 20 pixels in between each of them. Now why this again gets really awesome is I can put this here and I still have the padding on the left to it. So it just allows for really great flexibility of the overall media object as a whole. Now where it also has some really great advantages is, let's get rid of this align top. Oh, I'm in the... And let's add some stylistic things here. And I'm just going to create something that says VA top. I'll just call it VA top. So vertical, because it is using the display table cell, I can take advantage of the alignment vertically, top, middle, bottom, and baseline, and use these as helper classes. So I've just created 3 different classes, VA-T, VA-M, VA-B for top, middle, bottom. Now what I can do is I can align this guy, oops, T. So now it's aligned at the top. I can also do in the middle or at the bottom. And I can create different variations of this in different contexts. I may want it to be top aligned or middle aligned. So it allows me to have super flexibility of this guide. Now let's move this back so we can try to replicate what the first one looked like. And we'll just say VAT. And then I can actually use the other. I wanted to do this. Should work. Come on. Oh well. Does anyone remember what I saved that as? I don't. 70. Oh, thanks. And now if I, again, get rid of that teal color on the flag, that line, and add card here, these guys look identical, but they're different code, usage, and more flexibility. Oh, what am I missing here? When demos go wrong. Oh, it's not rendering it. There we go. So these are identical, but they're using 2 different code bases. The only thing is the flag object. I can switch the placement of the image, and it can be completely flexible. So I can copy this guy and make a variation of it where the image is now on the right as opposed to the left. I can also make a version of it where the text is aligned in the middle. Very quickly, do one more thing. So this guy is aligned in the middle, and this content's over here. Come on. So that's by, I guess, a quick example of what the media object is and some basic design principles between flag, media, and object-oriented CSS. So any questions on that?
So what does the display table and table cell do?
Mm-hmm. So display table renders a container as a HTML table as a whole. So it's the same. It would be the same rendering as if I said table, and I did something like this, and I had something like this. Jeez. So this guy right here, just so we can identify it. It's going real slow on the updates. So these guys act the same way, but these are using these elements, and it also has to require this extra layer, and there's some other additional wrappers that are inside tables. But if I actually inspect the TD here, it has a display table cell right here. And what I've done here is I've mimicked with a div a table cell. So by default it's a block, but it allows me to render a div or any type selector as a table.
And then with that, that allows us to do the vertical line
Yeah.
relatively easily.
Yep. And the vertical align is not on the individual element, but it's the container as a whole. Because if you use vertical align on two elements next to each other, it acts a little bit differently. But it's treated the exact same way as if you're using a table. So again, if I were to revisit our table friends, it's a middle here, it would act the same way if this image was bigger. But you get the picture. It's the same thing.
I just have a comment. I like seeing this example because I see a lot of examples online where they use like margin and float to try to get that what you're doing here on the right.
Yeah.
So thanks for this example.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of those weird quirkinesses with CSS is this guy to get this structure. It's one of those hacks unless someone told you would never really think to do that. Because most people do that padding left or absolute positioning, and then you've just added like way too many actual properties to get something. And in reality, all I care about is that main is padded left from the actual image itself.
And I guess with media and flag and how they kind of do the same thing, but flag does a lot more. Is there ever a time that you would choose media over flag?
So one thing that I kind of skipped over this into this really quickly. I don't know if you picked up on it. I added full inside here. Media is really nice because it renders as a block, and table rendering is kind of weird and goofy at times. So it's table, you need to define it as a width of 100% for it to actually fill the container. If the content is less than the parent container's width, it will only go to the width that it needs. So if I put something like a border around it, as I did with the card selector, it doesn't look right. Now, if you added this as a wrapper around it, and I put card and then put the flag object inside of it, it'd be okay. But it's just, there's different contexts of using a display table versus display block. There's nothing wrong with using the media object. I usually include them both in my project. And to kind of just also illustrate why, if I put this over here, I don't even know where so do you see how the image is floating down here as opposed to being up on the right where you think it would be in the media object? It requires some additional finagling. There's use cases for both. I probably use them just equally as much nowadays. So, and I include both of them in projects. Any other questions?
You know, are there any tools for finding like duplicate classes like you talked about earlier?
Inspector. And that's about it. There are some gulp tasks that you can have, but again, seeing any strike-throughs in your CSS outside of the user agent or the inherited, if you're seeing that on your selector, that's something that you want to avoid. So if I had, let's just say,
But you're still going through and manually trying to find
Yeah.
those?
yeah,
Did you find that with the duplicate?
That's what I was kind of wondering. You know, is there something that actually searches and finds those or flags those for you?
but the hard thing about it is it needs to know the way that it's actually cascading and rendering through. There are some gulp libraries which I would kind of steer away from doing them unless you're just using it to identify those issues as a whole. If there's some libraries that CSS is a task and it will remove duplicate properties and classes, but then the issue is how does it know which one is the right one if there's an additional property and it doesn't ever combine it. So then when you have to update, say, a selector and one's way down here and one's way up here, like in your actual CSS file, and you're updating it down here, but then you never realize that this is also up here. And by up here, I mean an actual selector with properties inside of it.
There's I think in Chrome, if you enable like web page performance in the options, in there it says CSS molds and selectors that aren't being used. So if you have now that maybe the particular page doesn't have that class or that ID, but it'll help you when you're factoring lots of CSS.
Yeah. And right here, this is what I was talking about, the strike through. So the strike through right here, that's an easy way of identifying it. And you should try to avoid having strike throughs as much as possible. And the only time that it's kind of appropriate is if I go to the flag object here. So let me get rid of that. If I go to the flag object, and you can see that display block is the default user agent for the element. So the div element has a display block rendered from the user agent, but I'm overriding it in the CSS. That's okay because it is from its user agent, or if it's inheritance, it's okay. Another example would be if I did like flag, font family, monospace. Because this is now an example of inheritance overriding. So here's a user agent override, which is fine. And then here is the inheritance override on the body. So I added Arial for the body styles. And I'm overriding both of them right here, as well as right here.
In case of like, if this were like a stream of comments for like an article or something like that, and you were denoting like a class modifier on a flag item that was like, that belonged to, let's say, the author of that article, and that just made like the H2 have a different color, for instance.
Mhm.
Would you advocate overriding the default or pulling out the color into a default class as well,
So
into a default modifier?
maybe you lost me on the styling.
Yeah, so like if you were to do like flag dash dash author,
Mhm.
and you target like the H2 of that author to be red, but your default H2 in the flag item was green, would you pull that out into like a flag dash dash default, or?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, just to make sure, so the flag object shouldn't have like the styling inheritance.
Yeah, wherever you put that modifier on,
Yeah.
I'm saying like, would you pull out like the default
instance of that like property that you're changing into a helper class as well.
In the case of you do have to override, I mean, because there are cases where then there's edge cases all the time. It's okay if it's overriding. It just you need to make sure that in CSS it's just in the right position or it's higher specificity.
It's actually an audit. It takes 2 seconds to remember your dev tools.
Yeah.
This is really helpful. It's like, if you go to audits and just click run, if you scroll down that fella, click run. This will tell you a bunch of unused things. So there's probably, if you scroll down, remove unused CSS rules. Like CodePen's a huge website.
Yeah.
But that's only the current page that you're on. So it's kind of risky to just delete stuff that's not being used in your current context. But it is helpful for removing float.
Yeah. But,
basically delete and pray.
yeah. All those things are always like, something that I wouldn't recommend. But unless you identify what they are, and a lot of that just goes back to the architecture of the HTML and CSS.
Where can we learn more about these other design patterns?
We can just continue talking about them, bring them up. And there's a handful of other ones out there. Yeah. Like the Holy Grail was another one, and that's kind of evolved over time with responsive. So the 3-column, you know, and it's usually the base structure for like the sidebar, main body, and then the secondary nav. Yeah, it's weird that there isn't a website of common UI containers and patterns, but there are a lot of them out there, and this is probably the most common out of any of them. Let's see. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, please.
All right, cool. Thank you guys for your time.
Thank you.